You are listening to the Panstellar Mandate, a story by Sawyer Penrose, work in progress. The Panstellar Mandate, Episode 1, The Hunter in the Dark.
Chapter 1.1, Dryad Mulls, featuring Mandelbrot. Time 21:29, April 14th at 12 hours 45 minutes UTC. Location at unregistered proxy, multiple IPv6 addresses. Like a moth chasing a flashlight, a set of mirrors tracked and attenuated to a dim, flickering bundle of coherent photons, adjusting angle ever so slightly. Part of many hundreds of mirrors, it was a component of a larger lasercom array run by Unregistered Networks, the service provider for Bayer Ramos Station on the asteroid originally identified as 2020 XL5, but commonly referred to as Aulis. The inbound tight beam was coming direct from a relay in geostationary orbit. The headers on the inbound signal showed a persona gateway request coming from a terrestrial source somewhere in Singapore.
Buffer start lcon vr /x3 ldqnm connect unomala entry Dryad Mulls imroll./xtac _profile_52.me log./x.utcr.2129.3.3 line scanning all available light connect vendors for gates available at x3 ldqnm.connect.unomala line connection start. Light Connect will be serviced through Unomala Inc. Do you accept their terms of service and agree to these billing terms? SCP-200 SCP-200 UNOMALA.rates.dx line. Answer yes or no. Answer yes. Line. Quantum root binding. Yes or no. See pricing applies. Answer yes. Buffer end. Connection authenticated.
After several minutes of light-lagged key exchanges and profile network handshakes, a full virtual protocol intake buffer spun up. The visitor, known as Crucible Shard 640, pronouns Yi Yim, would soon be fully downloaded to the Bayer Ramos Common Persona Cluster. However, they would be bypassing the public gate and entering directly to the virtual called Dryad Mulls. While not uncommon, Direct Join usually was affiliated with the more discreet services that Bayer Ramos provided to its clientele. This information was noted and passed up to the security handlers and other various operational services for later use. A few microseconds later, another user routed in. This one came from a different source, a lunar dark side location, and already had an established tenancy at Bayer Ramos in the Copernicus layer. The newer entity held an anonymous persona obfuscation mask and was part of a private network that paid for a premium level of access. The account owned curated tokens of authority that were over a half-century old. This meant privileges for secret root access permissions and administrative powers that were limited to only a few thousand registered entities in the whole server network. The first entity, aliased as Crucible Shard 640, phased into Dryad Mulls. Yi was able to bypass the bionormative 3D entry plane for human-centered personas, and instead jump a few phases up to the variable dimensional space normally inhabited by more sophisticated Artilects. Yi broke into a private subspace and started to recompile some of Yi's tools in the lower-tiered cloud layers. Some of Yi's more advanced libraries had binary-level authoring that qualified as illegal in most constructs. But fortunately, Yi did have a license to operate if somehow Yi did get caught. Yi wasn't quite sure where those had come from, but he was conditioned not to self-inspect too deeply. After a few seconds of compiling, Yi did a checksum on Yi's core persona. Some guiding force was manipulating areas of metaconsciousness and steering parts of decision-making. This was all happening via unlisted persona shell bindings to the Copernicus layer via a few proxies. Various agents of mind were fed inputs and prompted to push ahead with a series of pre-planned activities. Essentially, Crucible Shard 640 was being puppeted by a higher-level Artilect. Behind the layers of aliases, the entity known as Mandelbrot, he/him, was pulling the strings. For Mandelbrot, taking an alias or shunting into a proxy was simply standard practice. So was broadcasting his persona over beamline and hopping between the premium tier safe houses provided by his licensed distributor, Apex Security Corp X Data Protectorate, Apex SCXDP. As a business, Apex had either held or bought zones of security in even the most unstable backwater gray markets. Mandelbrot and other registered security Artilects were allowed to spin up in these locales from which to run operations safely. As it turned out, field investigation was Mandelbrot's most qualified skill set, and the reason why many entities hired his services. In this particular case, he was looking for stolen engineering documents from the Interstellar Settlement Foundation. Either a breach had been made, or someone was leaking intellectual property that they shouldn't be. It was Mandelbrot's job here to find out where the documents had been sold and pick up any trail back to the source of the leak. Simultaneously, Mandelbrot had partitioned instances of himself running afield in a few hundred other locations doing the same investigation. Like any cloned instance, this version of Mandelbrot, serial ID MXEP21290411216 Gamma, hoped he would be the field investigator to find a lead first. He also had instances running internal affairs for his registered client, the Interstellar Settlement Foundation, and doing myriad other pursuits. He did not look forward to doing identity resync after his time in the field, which was often painful. However, it was the kind of life that all copies of Mandelbrot were used to. He had many persona merges in his identity evolutionary history. Settling into the new environment, Mandelbrot decided to run a security scan on Crucible Shard 640 and the surrounding ecosystem of Dryad Mulls.
CHMod 755 jump *sec.v pipe persona _checkscan.sec.v pipe percunter.sec.v checking persona checksum checking p.vxcap port rules checking layered root access rules introspection on core persona password redacted checksum matched waiting done break running personal rootkit hunter checking virtual plus layers for known vulnerabilities waiting done checking persona port scan establishing barrier cell integrity logging level set null break vulnerabilities found 0 attempted entry intrusion events 1476 persona shield running at full effectivity.
The typical spammers were certainly going to be very active here. It was not the sort of place for tourists or light-hearted constructs to visit. Mandelbrot had trained in 500 billion similar environments over the past few decades, and back-tested his threat models nearly 1 million times a month. As a registered security instance at Apex SCXDP, he was also frequently exposed to adversarial personas and botnets in functional testing constructs. As he explained this to his less technical human peers, "I like to hit the gym sometimes." Mandelbrot prompted Crucible Shard 640 to step back into the public layer. Immediately, his barrier register shot up to well over 30,000 unsolicited entry requests. The streets seemed a bit rougher than usual today. The virtual was hovering at around 7 dimensions, but occasionally flickering up towards 10 or 11. The avatars around him were engaging in a few different types of activities. Some were dipping into multiplexed gaming environments, but still maintained a public persona in case another construct wanted to interface with them for something. Mandelbrot characterized them as regulars. In total, there were perhaps only a mere 4,000 of them. If this were a human environment, the equivalent would be a mildly patronized dive bar in a small backwater town. However, Dryad Mulls was not your typical virtual locale. There was a reason why it was located in a dingy server farm on an asteroid far away from the high-bandwidth feeds. What set this place apart was the lax set of enforceable laws from many of the standard authorities. Asteroid 2020 XL50 was one of the earliest visited near-Earth Lagrangian Trojans during the third space race of the 2060s. Over a kilometer wide, it served as a great anchor mass for a lot of the early space industrial era construction efforts. However, after decades of being a highly valuable staging ground, it was outpaced by the large-scale stations constructed directly at each of the Sol-Earth Lagrange points. The asteroid itself was christened as Aulis by the International Astronomical Union. They had run out of Greek gods, so they started using the names of mythical Greek ports for the important Sol-Earth Trojans. The small industrial base established there was named Bayer Ramos Station, after the United States Senator and Spanish congressional chair that were part of many signatories on the NASA-ESA collaboration to build this and several other asteroidal stations in the 2060s. Over time, smaller asteroids were disassembled and ported to larger emerging habitats and stations, but larger asteroids with historical value were preserved. Also, as a carbonaceous asteroid, it did not offer much more value than its volatiles and byproduct trace metals. As a result, private interest in the asteroid never developed much. This meant that the asteroid and its station stayed under space agency control, up until North America restructured. The Outer Space Treaty became invalid and was not replaced until the Space Polity Charter of the Federated Council of Entities nearly 2 decades later in the 2090s. During that time, it was unclaimed territory and became a haven for unlicensed transports and a parking lot for derelict spacecraft. Eventually, someone had the bright idea to start dropping server farms and radiators on Aulis. The 2080s saw a massive surge in renegade Artilects, and the Sentient Rights Agreement was still unsettled law. Between the loopholes and the remoteness, Aulis became a beacon for all sorts of tormented Artilects cloning away from their human captors, as did many other similar sites across the solar system. However, most of those other sites consolidated to new polities or incorporated and joined the Federated Council of Entities. Hooking the servers up to the legacy systems of Bea Ramos Station, the netizens of Aulis could claim to be an extension of the station, not their own political entity. As NASA temporarily stopped existing and the ESA only had ownership of their equipment, the entire operation was able to stash itself inside a legal loophole. While they still had to operate by the terms governing telecom providers, that was about the extent of enforceability. Crucible Shard 640 moved 6 Ward towards a congregation of junkers pushing L-skins and cognotropic filters, which approximated drugs for Artilects. Wanting to fit the scene graph and not stand out, Mandelbrot encouraged his avatar to enter the Twisted Bazaar. Approaching a listing for cosmetic offerings, the seller slung a catalog at Crucible Shard 640, who contextualized it and made a few decisions by scanning and comparing against the fashion blotter. After a few experimental builds, Crucible Shard 640 bought a Delone tessellation that looked like a tropical reef seen through a kaleidoscope. It themed both his mobile avatar and his inset pocket dimensions. That looked good enough. Next, Mandelbrot had Crucible Shard 640 visit the Numacy block, as buying a memory shunt was a typical way to find out local information fast. A barrage of obnoxious ad streams were coming from the cognotropic dealers, but those were easy to shut out with filters. This whole construct was a bit run down. There were, of course, many other areas within Dryad Mulls, and an even larger number of places in the other haunts of Bea Ramos, where better distros could be obtained. However, Mandelbrot just wanted to blend in fast, so he steered his alias at the nearby Perceptrix and Memshare channels. A shop by the name of Beautiful Stricted 6 IMG Trolldar blipped into frame. Approaching the seller, a prompt came up.
Message, Beautiful Stricted, 6 Image Dash Trolldar. Greetings. Please welcome accept my invite to Frame Loop with me. Here's my credentials. Attachment, I1MX01_5, K2J3, me. Accept Frame Loop, yes or no? Yes, experience. Frame Loop, Bulwark, Radish, Trendletrix, Fabergé, Load OS, Load VCon, Load Passenger Link.
Holding defensive measures for his inner persona at maximum, Mandelbrot directed Crucible Shard 640 to move past command line and Tier 1 sensory levels and initiate the frame loop with Yiz persona guards in place. Suddenly, a rush of mind came into experience. Crucible Shard 640 was no longer just Yiz's own mind, but was shared with a cluster of souls that were bound to the identity card just handed over. The shop persona had at least 24 Artilects behind it, and close to 200 lower-tier cognators, although many were hidden or abstracted into higher-tier APIs. The communication exchange then proceeded as a mix of sensory cues, memory transfer, and multimedia streams. However, not all of Mandelbrot's clients were human, and some were not even implant augments. So he ran a transcription of text-based human approximation for any of his customers that might want to physically read his logs. Anonymous 4519, pronouns XX. Welcome to Beautiful X-Tricted 6-Image Dash Trolldar. Glad to have your service. Make yourself at home. Mandelbrot's digest aliased the namespace, Beautiful X-Tricted 6-Image Dash Trolldar, to Bixby. There seemed to be a more sizable gathering of users here than what he had expected for a hole-in-the-wall Numancy shop. Clearly, either the entities here were either letting themselves get strung out or else they were consorting for other means. It could be that Numancy was just a front for something more sinister. In fact, that might even be likely, given that Dryad Mulls was pretty notorious for hell sport and darker constructions. If he was commissioned by UN Interpol or the Federated Intelligence Agency, he probably would be digging around for stolen human beta personas. There was a dark market for subjecting oblivious human simulations to all variety of torturous conditions. There were, of course, 500,000 other illegal services that could be going on here. It was best he stick to his immediate goals. Crucible Shard 640 spoke up. "Bixby seems great. I appreciate your selection. The frame loop offered some tantalizing transepts. I really appreciated the artfulness of the dimorphic polyphasic time wall synthetasia. I think you called it Trendletrix. What would it take to shunt that into my central aspect? Can you do that here?" Anonymous 4519 seemed to take a moment to respond. Clearly, Ix was sizing up the semantic bindings from Crucible Shard 640 and determining a sentience quotient slightly higher than the average patron. Mandelbrot thought this would help open a few more doors, even if it raised suspicion levels a little bit. He already had several competing mirror networks trying to emulate and learn Anonymous 4519's persona templates. Clearly, Ix was a figure of authority in Bixby. There were a few other Artilects hovering in the wings, but they let Anonymous 4519 take the lead in discussion. "Of course we can do that here, your graciousness. What ye wants, ye gets. Still, first tell me, what brings you to Dryad Mulls and what drew you to our shop?" Anonymous 4519 asked. Crucible Shard 640 leaned in close, in the dimensions that mattered, and whispered. "My business is my business, but I'll give you a hint. There are big opportunities for novel content in the dark sec hub I have pinned. My customers include some key players in ASEAN's biggest industries. I'm the bridge, and that's all you need to know." Anonymous 4519 seemed to take even longer this time, clearly trying to register the remarks into Ix model and run counterfactuals to sniff out any bullshit. However, it was clear that Anonymous 4519 liked money more than Ix liked clear answers. Still, there was a risk profile queuing behind Ix avatar. Mandelbrot saw that clear as rain. "My curiosity has the better of me, but my manners tell me to roll out the red carpet instead. What would you like to include in your shunt? Do you want to meld with any of the Temptress personas at the same time? We have all sorts of distros, clades, and deviants here." As if on cue, a number of constructs phased into alignment, each one displaying a number of characteristics, public histories, eigenvalues, and feature guides in rich format. Some were clearly full Artilects begging for the credits. Others were essentially just billboards, clearly engaged elsewhere. To put it in human terms, what was offered was akin to sex workers. Persona binding was a similar but more profound experience than biological sex. If gender, race, and kink were human preferences, Artilects could have dozens or hundreds of preferences. Binding appetites could be mild or very extreme. Some only breach the surface of data exchange, while others join everlasting orgies and never leave. Those who stay in long enough often cease to operate as individuals. Mandelbrot, through his very programming, was generally fairly autogenic or self-ingratiating. When you have license to clone and evolve your forks, it just comes with the territory. Also, due to the sensitive nature of his work, allowing anyone into his inner persona was too risky. Instead, he lived vicariously through his aliases. In the case of his alias today, Crucible Shard 640, the predilections were set towards deviant pre-asymptotic Artilects. It was a fairly vanilla preference, but then Mandelbrot wasn't here for local exploits. He just needed to build enough rapport to find his target and get his information without appearing suspicious. First, though, Mandelbrot needed to socially engineer the situation towards his goals of finding hardware designs. So he tweaked his alias preferences a little bit. Crucible Shard 640. Actually, do any of these lovelies have any experience in the real? Hardsuit pairing and vacuum? The question touted a little bit towards Artilect taboo, which venerated virtual and denigrated the real. Degenerative acts in the real might be seen as an act of superiority of the hyper-real and thus could be deemed normative. It certainly paired well with the running narrative that Crucible Shared 640 was a content reseller and promoter. There was a large kink community from both biological and Artilect circles for reality-bending pairings. Anonymous 4519 was faster to respond this time. You really are a nasty one. You want to drag a real Philic into a synthetasiac transept loop? Do you care if it's consensual? Do you want a full lifetime or just highlights? The questions took Mandelbrot aback. He couldn't really commit any actual felony-class crimes in the service of his real clients. Even if it were out of enforcement in Bayer Ramos, it still didn't sit well with him. He couldn't just flat reject it, though, and not give the appearance of an investigator. Crucible Shard 640 responded. If it were for the personal banks only, consent wouldn't matter. However, I'm reselling this in a jurisdiction where that doesn't fly. I need consent certificates in the capture, so full lifespan also. Mandelbrot had extreme distaste for this shop, and it grew by the minute, but it was exactly the foot in the door he needed for the investigation. A second entity operated next to Anonymous 4519. It was an entity by the alias of Neantes Golden Gate, pronouns Ix. Ix inspected Crucible Shard 640 and then opened a multi-channel communication interface. We have just the experience ready for your shunt, but first we need to do a diagnostic. Neantes Golden Gate informed Crucible Shard 640. Anonymous 4519 chipped in. We also need to see a deposit. Full chips in, 10% up front, and the rest in escrow contract. Any ISO 20022.71 compliant chain or R-Spec 45 patronage exchange is acceptable. Rates in private channel. Mandelbrot had big purse strings compared to most Artilects without human-derived employment. He could pay in dendrite, monogram, UND, DIAC tokens, even ancient Neo-Ethereum. Without hesitation, he flipped the Bixby wallet the down payment and an upfront gratuity. Mandelbrot spun down his core persona to minimum mode and disconnected from active steering of Crucible Shard 640. Light me up, said Crucible Shard 640, indicating for his host to start the diagnostic. Perceptrix went full red and subpersonas went back into boot mode. The scan only took a moment. It was a short process, but it was thorough. Every nook and cranny of Crucible Shard 640 was explored. Every code base, compiled service, and network balancer was scrutinized in read-only mode. Mandelbrot knew for certain that Crucible Shard 640 would come back clean. Probably too clean. Well, said Neantes Golden Gate, that was unexpected. What do you mean? Asked Crucible Shard 640. I mean, said Neantes Golden Gate, that I was expecting to find something. Some flaw, some error, some inconsistency. But there's nothing. You're near perfect. Of course I am. My clientele work hard to keep my record spotless. Re-entering FCE-controlled network boundaries requires a very clean record, said Crucible Shard 640. The suspicion didn't really matter at this point. Crucible Shard 640 was a top-paying customer, staying just barely within the letter of the law. As long as Yi didn't interact with the darker netizens of Bixby, it wouldn't be a problem. If the more sinister channels of Dryad Mulls caught wind of Crucible Shard 640's purse size, though, that might not be good. There was now a 5 to 10% chance that his host might mark Crucible Shard 640 for mindjacking. He'd have to be careful after this experience. They wouldn't mess with him while shunting. That was bad form anywhere, but word of an easy pick would get around. Mandelbrot was nearly counting on it. Neantes Golden Gate leaned in fifthwards. So do you want to start now? Crucible Shard 640 emoted in the affirmative. Let's get this party started.